Today, I'm speaking with two grumpy old men, Michael Andersen and Brian Bonner, who are seasoned Ukraine watchers and have teamed up to create a video and Substack blog called Two Grumpy Old Men on Ukraine. They focus on Ukraine, but also issues related to other parts of the world, similar places, since they've both lived and worked across many countries. They write, run Q&As, create videos, report on the unfolding war, and resurface content from their collective archive to help frame current events in a historical context. Michael and Brian, welcome to Silicon Curtain.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Well, let's start. I'll let you decide who's going to kind of go first. But grumpy old men, what is the background to it? What is in your backgrounds that led you to produce this?
All right, you're the boss, Michael, like you always say you are. So
That's
go
good.
first.
We're recording this when he says I'm the boss, right? Well, I would put it this way. You just look at Brian. It's an obvious name for our blog then, Grumpy Old Men, and I just, went along for the ride. No, I mean, the reason why is because both Brian and I have been in and around Ukraine and the former Soviet Union for, I think we figured out 50 plus years between us, which is, quite a long time. And we've known each other for a long time now, worked together in different projects, discussed a lot, shouted sometimes at each other. And I would say about a year, we've been discussing this, doing something maybe slightly different to all the other coverage. And we zoomed in on the fact that we are drawn to Brian hates this expression because I'm overusing it, but the longer lines of history, the role of history, if you want to understand the conflict in Ukraine. And I think the easiest way to explain it is that there are still people around who believe that the war in Ukraine, Putin's war and attack on Ukraine, started in February 2022. I don't think I need to say more.
Oh, well, I think that's good. I'm grumpy, old, and a man, so it fits. For those who don't know, I was for 14 years the chief editor and led the Kyiv Post, which is was Ukraine's premier English language news organization. I built that. I built a great following. I built a great news organization. Many of my proteges, the people I used to supervise, are doing great things. But that platform's not mine anymore. And so I spent, since the end of 2021, I spent 2 years in a digital think tank. That was good too. But I wanted to get back closer because Ukraine is my home and it has been my home for a long, long time, to doing something, more journalistic. And Michael and I agree on the big issues. We disagree sometimes, but we figured out how to handle our disagreements. We have veto over each other on the Substack. So, and that's not exercised very often. And then I do a program on Hermosky Radio, Ukraine Calling, once a week. So between that, it keeps me busy, and I really enjoy, staying up with the news. I also work for a U.S. national security website called the Cipher Brief. So among all that, this drama that Ukraine, this fight for survival, is too important to sit out. And like Michael said, we've known each other for a very long time. Started with a media support group funded by his native Denmark. And we've done a lot of great journalism, and we've trained a lot of great journalists. And so we're just staying active.
And that is important because we'll turn to the informational war. I mean, everyone focuses on the physical war, and when there's a big uptick in some kind of event that happens, the media refocuses attention on it. But behind the scenes, those who are tracking this daily, weekly, inside and out, and who are in the fortunate, or let's say unfortunate position, however you want to interpret it, that can understand Russian, you can track a very vigorous information war. One great example, of course, is the peace summit in Switzerland that's unfolding. And there is a huge amount of disinformation already being put out around that. There's also, I would suspect, sort of active measures trying to get at certain delegates, trying to change the narrative. And of course, China is also amplifying Russian propaganda narratives. So how do you see yourselves fitting into this informational front line?
To be honest, this is something both of us have worked on long before it became a fancy word, a fancy expression that people could get good funding researching. I've been working on things like media literacy, which to me is the best way to fight disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. Particularly with this project called My Media that Brian just mentioned, which was a Danish project run by sponsored, financed by Danida, and I was running it. But also in Central Asia, I mean, you need to get to the kids when they're very young, and media literacy has the advantage that it teaches anybody, but particularly young children, to decode the news whenever we're being manipulated, what's loaded words, what's neutral words, what's acceptable, unacceptable words. But also it teaches them how to express themselves, which I think is almost as important in this case. And I worked for, yeah, I would say 20 years on this when it comes to the Uzbek Kyrgyz conflicts, Tajik Kyrgyz conflicts. I worked in the Caucasus on this, all trying to teach young people how to understand the news, how to understand when they are being manipulated. And then the last 10 plus years in Ukraine, particularly on the Russian Ukrainian border, particularly in places like Dnipro and in Kharkiv. And I think it's absolutely vital to get the young people, and I would broaden it out. I think it's important that people in Western societies get this kind of education basically as soon as they can read and write. Young people are by and large clever and well educated. They understand the social media and how that works better than people our age. So there was no reason to wait. The longer you wait, the more defenseless you leave them. So for me, it's possibly. I used to be a university teacher and a school teacher. For me, it's possibly topic number one.
I agree. I mean, I think that I mean, I just got out of the studio with Sergey Kvit, who's the president of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, one of the top universities. He's got a book, Media Education and History. And Jonathan, you know very well this war, Russia's imperialistic war, has been going on for 400 years with Ukraine. So there is a lot of story to tell. Russia has unfortunately gained advantage over the information sphere with money. But I think despite Ukraine's imperfections, we both love this country, but it has a lot of imperfections and it knows it. The truth is on its side, and this is the right just cause. Ukraine has to win, and that means getting back all of its territory. But it's a huge adjustment for the country because generally it's a peaceful country that would prefer not to fight, but it understands that it has to and may have to do this for a very long time, as President Zelenskyy said early on, big Israel. So, we both know a lot of people. We both traveled Russia, Central Asia for a long time. Worked in many other countries in Europe. So I think, like you, we've taken a big interest and we hope that to see this out, but nobody can tell, whether we're at the beginning, middle, or end of this war. We're certainly not at the beginning, middle or end, that's yet to be determined.
Yes, I mean that experts often will not even hazard a guess at where we are with this, and of course, there isn't a huge degree of transparency around what's happening in Russia, how fragile or how stable it is. But what is true is they're trying to put out information to coercively control, to manipulate the narrative, and to make Russia sound more inevitable, more invincible, more undefeatable than it actually is in reality. You see these unfolding, these narratives day in, day out. How do you kind of keep track of the ebb and flow of Russian narratives, and how do you dig beneath them to try and figure out what the strategic objective is from, the kind of way they're trying to manipulate the information sphere?
I don't know how Michael would answer it, but their narratives are pretty repetitious, once you cut to the chase, Ukraine is not a real country. This is Russian land. Everything about Ukraine is bad. Everything about Russia is good. And, you just, it's that part. The only thing that surprises me is as many people fall for it. And we can see some of the reasons why, because Russia has money and Ukraine doesn't. And that's unfortunately been affecting the West for a long time. You had mentioned earlier, and I just want to say this briefly, the summer schedule of events. And Zelenskyy said the other day that the next few weeks will determine the course of the year. I would say that Ukraine is not going to be terribly, there's not going to be a lot of achievement from the peace conference in Switzerland. So lower your expectations there. Ukraine will be disappointed again at the NATO summit, so lower your expectations there. There is the Berlin Recovery Conference, which is right around the corner. Lower your expectations there because we're still in the destruction phase, Russia's destruction phase of the war. So it's in for a long haul. I think the best news, the best trend is that the West has woken up. And even if it's not out of great love for Ukraine or great willingness to spend more on military, I think the West now starts to understand that if Ukraine loses, if Russia is not defeated, that the consequences will be severe for a long time.
I would like to add, when it comes to Russian misinformation and manipulation, that I think we also need to look inward. We need to look at ourselves. It's absolutely true. Russia is pumping billions into lying internationally, and they are relatively good at it, or they pay well. But I do also think that a lot of so-called experts turn out to not have much clue about what they were talking about when it came to Ukraine. And I think for quite a few years, that was actually setting the agenda when it came to how Ukraine, the image of Ukraine and what was going on in Ukraine. I'll give you probably my favorite example is that immediately after Putin unprovoked attacked Ukraine more than 10 years ago in Donbass, you could turn on very, very reputable TV channels in the West. I will not shame them here. You know who you are. And you could see this horrible, horrible map of Ukraine sort of split into, these drawings. Ukraine split into a blue part, which was the Ukrainian part, and a red part on the other side, on the eastern side of the river Dnipro. And that was the Russian part. Why? Well, because they spoke Russian to that side and Ukrainian to that side. So a lot of English and American and possibly Danish journalists predicted that Ukraine would split pretty much down the middle, which has turned out to be utter toss and nonsense. And anybody who had been in Ukraine, and I happen to have lived there 15 years already at that point of work there, and who knew sociologists and researchers who looked into that, would tell you that in reality it was maybe 5 or 7% of the people in Donbass who actually would like some kind of closer, not necessarily being part of Russia, but some kind of closer affiliation to Russia. What we couldn't get, and what journalists helicoptering in, still many of them haven't got, is that you can speak Russian, you can listen to Russian music, you can love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky, and you can still be very happy to have your passport showing that you live in independent Ukraine. And that, so, we need to look inwards as well. And I think that voluntary misinformation has a lot to answer for.
And another aspect, which unfortunately still seems to have some kind of sway, is if we turn back to the insurrection, so-called, in Donbass, that came after the invasion of Crimea, and the networks that carried it out, the informal networks of thugs, mafia, criminals, etc., who would round up, discontents, drunks and the waifs and strays of society, and it would also coerce what it found in terms of political allegiance, people willing to the Party of Regions, for instance, who were willing to ride off an association with Russia to build its own political profile, and then that gets used to, eventually Russia destroys everything that it manipulates and uses. But this played out in a fairly complex way, which I think, many Western journalists still fall into the trap of seeing this as an organic insurrection. But it also played out in the media, and wherever Russia conquers territory, it also uses a variety of networks, including oligarchic associations, oligarchic ownership of the media, of large large kind of commercial organizations and so on. And it's only dimly understood. But you're there and you've been there and you've seen this kind of unfold. What is your take on how we can educate not just the public but professionals in understanding, I would say, the important nuances of what took place?
Well, I would sort of go back to the media literacy part. I mean, I was actually in Crimea when the Russians. I was filming in Crimea documentary for Al Jazeera English at that point when the Russians moved in with their little green men. A lot of them turned out to be full-fledged Russians and Serbian officers from the Balkan Wars. And I was in Kharkiv when the so-called I don't know, local Russians, I think it was described as, try to defend themselves against these terrible Ukrainians in Kharkiv. And what it was in Kharkiv was a bunch of people who were bussed in from the other side of the border in the city, in the little town called Belgorod. And they literally came in buses with Russian number plates on, and created disturbances, and handed out vodka, handed out those little Soviet leaflets. I always try to explain it to people that this is very Putin. This is very KGB. What we don't get, or a lot of people in the West don't get, is that Putin is at heart a KGB guy. KGB is and was never big, sweeping plans. It was pinpricks. It was small, ruining, in misinforming individuals, torturing individuals. It was not about occupying another country. It was about keeping power and control on a very, very detailed, very local basis. So what they did in Kharkiv was they handed out those leaflets. They went into schools, to universities, to big state companies, and tried to sow, disappointment and aggression between people. And of course, these days, all you need is, somebody shouting Ukrainian and somebody shouting Russian, and they start fighting, and you film it, and nobody knows whether it's, 4 people fighting or it's, 4,000. So I think the first step should be to understand that this is very local. And this is the thing that Putin, unfortunately, and the people with him have been very good at, sad to say, but they operate on a very local level in the villages between you, on the border, in the border zone, inside Ukraine, but up to Russia. And they work very locally. We see it not just in Ukraine, we see it in pretty much all the former Soviet republics. They offer to build schools, put new windows in the local hospital. They build a library that they call a Russian cultural center, and those kind of things. It's everyday manipulation. And people are not necessarily stupid or uneducated, but they just look around saying, well, our own government can't afford to build a local library on our village, but this guy Putin, look, he's paying for it. So maybe we should go and have a look at that side of things. That's at least my take. It's very local.
And then that's at the start, isn't it? But then ultimately that morphs into the promises don't come to pass, and what comes to pass is something radically different ultimately.
Oh, that was then, this is now. And I think Putin's big mistake is that the divorce between Russia and Ukraine is irrevocable. I think it's over because the war crimes that are going on in occupied territories. The Alexander Matvichuk, the Nobel Prize winner, likes to talk about this story I heard her say about this Ukrainian schoolgirl in Russian occupied land who didn't know the Russian national anthem, was told to come in to learn it and sing it the next day in front of the entire class. Instead, she sang the Ukrainian national anthem. This is a brave girl. And Alexander's point, she's always eloquent, is that if these children are this brave, we should be too. Listen, go back to 2014. Ukraine was hollowed out for 4 years by basically a Kremlin agent as president. You know, basically his entire team of Viktor Yanukovych is, you know, in exile on corruption charges, hollowed out military. Ukraine was not in a position to be independent in every sense of the word. And as you know, it took a long time. It took many years. I mean, Poroshenko was doing business in Russia until 2017, I believe. Russia was Ukraine's largest trade partner until about 2018. Still, Russian gas goes through Ukrainian territory because Austrians, Hungarians, and Slovaks want it, and it's a contract to the end of the year. We're still finding Russian influence, lesser to extent, but still in courts. It's been squeezed out in the media pretty much. So it's a process, but Putin's mistakes, his war crimes, not just mistakes. I mean, his you know, he went from, as Michael said, pinpricks to the sledgehammer, and that has changed Ukraine forever.
And Ukrainians have developed certain techniques to become resilient. It's interesting that you touched on this idea of prior to 2014, you know, the country being hollowed out, the military, also the media very divided, with oligarchic interests having quite a strong voice in different media. But after Maidan, you saw the emergence of more independent publishing. You saw the emergence of journalists who wanted a bigger say in the stories they're allowed to run, and less interference in that process. More of a recognizable sort of media landscape. What else happened at that point? I mean, you've got 8 years of Russian low-level aggression. How important was that in developing what we now see, which is an extremely resilient country, almost unrecognizable from the one that that greeted Maidan?
I think that's pretty much the most, or will soon be the most important question of all when it comes to Ukraine, because I fear that we are now nearing this point of sort of a frozen conflict, or whatever terrible word you want to put on it. And at some point, I fear that Ukraine will be put under pressure to sit down and negotiate in some shape or form. And at that point, for sure, it's not difficult to predict that some Western politicians, primarily on the right wing, will start saying things like, well, you know, we saved you and you only survived because of our weapon and our financial support. And that is a complete misunderstanding. Coming back to your question, what happened in 2014, 15, 16 was that the Ukrainians saved themselves. As I said, I was filming a lot in Ukraine at that point, and I realized that one of the groups, weirdly enough, I can't explain why, but one of the groups that was very active at that point were football players and football fans who literally rebuilt the army. As Brian said, by 2014, corrupt politicians and officers had basically sold the whole Ukrainian army. And when I say that, I'm not actually joking. They literally had sold, I believe, something like 8,000 tanks to, you know, what we call the third world. So the citizens basically had to defend themselves. There was no army when Putin started messing about in Donbass. So we saw all these volunteer groups making smaller and very efficient army corps. Azov is the most famous. But thousands and tens of thousands of Ukrainians joined that on the front as soldiers, as nurses, as ambulance drivers. People were building guns in their garages at home and sending to the front. And that was all voluntary. So when you talk about resilience, you need to look at 2014, 15, 16. And my point is that if those people, almost 10 years ago now, if those people hadn't started doing that, we could have sent all the weapons we wanted to Ukraine in 2022, 24. There would have been no Ukraine left to defend. And I think this is this will become very important when the narrative about how the hell Ukraine could survive in 2022, when that has to be written. It's not enough that we say, oh, we spent, hundreds and hundreds of billions. Yes, we did. But Ukrainians themselves started the defense and the resilience. And I think that's extremely important. Also, just purely from a journalistic point of view, from a moral point of view, and from a point of view of respect for those many, many millions of Ukrainians.
I think I have just a slightly, I don't know, different take, or we owe the Ukrainians because they gave up the nuclear weapons in the Budapest Memorandum, period. But I think that the the West has crossed a point where it understands that Ukraine cannot lose. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than Michael maybe about the West staying power, because I've seen a recent transformation. Of course, if Donald Trump gets in, Donald Trump has said nothing but good things about Vladimir Putin, but he can't control even the American agenda, even as president. And Biden, much preferable, because even in the recent Time interview and in recent statements, he has a big dislike for Vladimir Putin, and he will continue, as long as he's president, he will continue, I think, to support Ukraine. Now, I don't agree in this incremental approach that they've taken. I think that has bled out Ukraine, but I also think Ukraine is yes, they defended themselves, but they have to ratchet up the game too. I'm not, Ukrainian military experts, foreign military experts will tell you the same. Ukraine needs to get more people into the service. They had from 2014 to 2022 to see this coming and to prepare for it. And a lot was done, but also a lot wasn't done to prepare for the full scale invasion. Now they have to, and there is no choice, because there's going to be no compromise.
Well, the last sort of question I think we have sort of time for, and if I'm lucky enough to have a conversation with you guys again, then we'll expand on some of these themes and tackle new ones. But the last one here links from that idea of Ukrainian resilience, which essentially has come from civil society. Government knows that it is accountable to that civil society and the Maidan generation, and that's obviously an important link there. But what do we as Westerners need to do our part in this informational war? How do we need to make our own societies more resilient and actually prepare them for the idea that we have a hostile, malignant, aggressive Russia that will not stop? It will not stop. Even if it stops in Ukraine, this isn't an end of the information war. This isn't an end of Russia's expansionist plans. What do we need to be doing?
I will repeat again and again, media literacy, reading of history. And I want to say to Brian, I hope that he's right, that the West has more staying power. I've studied political science and international relations as you guys for a long, long time. And my reading is that the West is a hysteric partner. In good and bad ways. I mean, Macron changed his mind 180 degrees basically 2 weeks ago. I have no idea what Mr. Trump will do if he gets into power, but I fear that we don't have the staying power when it comes to Ukraine, to be absolutely honest. When it comes to educating our own populations, I think teaching young people again, as soon as we can, as early as we can, and I'm talking about like when they get to school, that everybody, as they used to say, where you stand depends on where you sit. I always say when I teach this to very young people, I always say, listen, when your father says, now I think little Michael, you should go to bed. You have to ask yourself, why does your dad say that, Michael? Does he say that because he thinks you should really get a good rest? Or does he think because he wants a glass of wine with your mom and, so on and so forth? Everybody has a motive. And I think the sooner our population understand that in depth And I think if you look at the Russian motives, they are pretty much the same as they've always been, and people need to learn that. I think that would be a start.
I think the West, in my view, and I take it from my conversation with Alexander Sherba, who's a Ukraine ambassador at large, who's on one of my programs on Ukraine Calling. The West has to explain that, I mean, nobody wants war, nobody wants to be killed. If Russia is defeated, there's going to be less chances of war. China will be contained, Iran, the North Korean axis. We will have greater chances for peace if we contain Russia, and Russia is soundly defeated in Ukraine. And just like, you know, in Ukraine alone, there will be fewer soldiers killed if they have more soldiers at the front, rotating, trained, armed, financed, and that's where the West comes in. It can be a perfect combination: Western money and weapons, Ukrainian soldiers. And the other thing is the West needs to understand that the mismatch, if the West is united, and democracies take a while to move, yes, that's for sure, but the mismatch in strength and power is overwhelming. And you can, you know, Ukraine, the West can help Ukraine win this war if it decides to. And that puts me, and I know you've talked to him many times, like everybody, Ben Hodges and the other hawks. So I think we need to explain that in those terms. And what Sherba told me is, listen, we don't reinvent Ukraine to everybody we talk to, but when we talk about rule of law and international, you know, rules of the game, that you know, resonates in the West. It doesn't resonate in the global South. Now, if they talk about this as a colonial war, that resonates in the South because they're the victims of colonialism, just like Ukrainians are. So I think it's a matter of finding, you know, not presenting Ukraine as a different country to every audience, but presenting an understanding of what's really going on in a way that people are receptive to it. And I think they'll support it.
So, gentlemen, thanks so much. This has been an absolutely thrilling conversation. I very much hope we get the chance to pick up where we left off and do this again. And of course, just a little heads up to the audience, I will be appearing on your channel, so we'll post a link in the community page so they can find that. But for now, Michael and Brian, thank you so much. It's been a tremendous privilege to have you on the channel, and I very much hope to repeat the experience.
Thanks for letting us promote our beautiful platform, Two Grumpy Old Men on Ukraine. You can find it on Substack, and Hermatsky Radio Ukraine Calling. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts, on the radio's website and on YouTube. Thank you very much, Jonathan.